Hi there, and welcome to a bonus episode of Two Texts. John Andrews recently released his latest book, and we thought you might be interested in hearing about it. So for the next two bonus episodes, we're going to be talking about John's new book, Second Chance. So John, you wrote another book. My Facebook tells me it's out and in the world.
Yes, David, that is correct. It was actually all done and dusted and ready to go just before Easter, but we felt Easter's about Jesus in that sense and didn't want to sort of feel that you were starting to launch a book there. So we waited till after Easter to promote it. But new book. It's called Second Chance, The Fall and Rise of John Mark. So I've really enjoyed writing it. It's been a labour of love, probably 20 years in the making in terms of some of the work and teaching and research I've done in the past. But I'm really, personally, I feel very humbled and thrilled that I've been able to bring the book to light. So it's out and it's a go. So enjoying that.
I like it. Well, given that you are the only one of the two of us that seems to actually be able to publish books, the less I say about my stack of things I'm supposed to be writing at the moment, the better. But what I thought would be great to do is we've just come to the end of our series called Jesus Begins, and we'll be working on some new series to come out very, very shortly. But the timing just lined up really well. I said to you, John, what if the Two Text community want to hear a little bit of the sort of background story of this character, John Mark? Not a book review, but for the next two episodes, just a little bit of the conversation as the study. You've done all this study into John Mark, and I thought, hey, well, why don't we do something where we talk a little bit about that for the next two sort of bonus episodes? And if it whets your appetite, go and buy John's book, and just you can dig somewhat deeper than even the conversation that we'll have today. Yeah. Does that sound like fun?
That
John?
Sounds wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate your generosity in doing that, and we are going to stay faithful to the two texts by leaning into two texts within the John Mark story, which hopefully will frame the wider story. This is a gorgeous redemptive story that is just tucked away in the New Testament text. There's a little golden thread of references that are there about this young man called John Mark. And of course, we've got a little bit of extra biblical stuff that we know that really does bring a beautiful and traumatic conclusion to the story of John Mark. But it's a story worth telling.
I mean, the almost question, John, that maybe somebody is thinking as you're talking just there is, so we're going to spend this episode and the next episode looking at two texts about John Mark. Are there even two texts about John Mark? I mean, and I'm not trying to be funny with that, but somebody might go, oh goodness, where would I even start to find anything out about John Mark? So
it's remarkable that there are 9 beautiful, at times controversial, unique references to John Mark in the New Testament. Now, sort of 5 of them are.
Is there a prize if somebody can call in with all 9? Because that would be. I don't even want to answer that question.
That's right. That would be very, very impressive. I think people are genuinely shocked when they hear that. Now, 5 of the references are in the book of Acts itself, and we're going to lean into one of those, and then the other 4. To help our listeners, we've got one in Colossians, 2 Timothy, Philemon, and 1 Peter. So 3 of those 4 references outside of the book of Acts are to do with Paul, and you'll see the significance of that once we do our first conversation. And then the last one is a reference from Peter.
Now, so that interests me, John, even in terms of early Christian history. Here's a character. There's a lot of discussion around kind of the development of Christian traditions and all that, but here's a character that Luke, Peter, and Paul have all saw fit to mention. Like outside of Jesus, I'm even wondering who's out there that gets that level of profile in the New Testament.
Well, if you look at the sort of word count for John Mark, he gets more personal named word count than some of the core disciples of Jesus. So if you think of some of the, outside of the classic core of
Yes.
Peter, James, John, maybe Thomas, maybe Judas, then you're actually struggling for word count on
Yes.
detail. Whereas John Mark gets 9 references, which when put together create this incredible story and this timeline of a story, which runs right through the New Testament text, and it's really worth our study. I found it a very moving journey. I found the story of John Mark really challenging personally, but also very moving. I found some of the references deeply, deeply touching. And I think it is a microcosm of the gospel, John's fall and then rise, and this incredible redemptive story of a young man being, if it, in many ways, reclaimed, repurposed, and re-energized in the gospel. So it's a beautiful, beautiful story. I think that one of the challenges with John Mark is because there are different names used of him. So. Of the references, we first introduced as John, also called Mark. And then a couple of times he's called John. And then I think the fourth reference is John, also called Mark. And then once we get out of the book of Acts, every direct reference is Mark. So you get this beautiful, even within some of our listeners who've followed our trajectory with the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts will know that it starts with a Jewish epicenter and moves to a Gentile world. And in many ways, John Mark's journey does exactly the same. Big picture, He seems to have a very, very strong Jewish identity to his beginning. And maybe that was part of his struggle with Paul. And then by the end of the story, by the end of the New Testament, he has totally embraced his sort of Roman name, Marcus, rather than his Hebrew name, Yohanan. So you get this sort of shift that seems to be taking place in his own journey. And of course, if our listeners know where he eventually ends up and how he eventually dies, there is a beautiful completion of that journey in his own story, which is a sort of a reflection of the book of Acts itself. It's quite lovely.
And of course, that's not even that model you've just talked about there. We have Simon, also called Peter, and you see this transition, and then Saul also called Paul. And there's a lot of tradition out there that these people are changing their names, but in the ancient context, having dual names is very common, particularly if you're working in a bilingual context.
Indeed.
So Saul would be a Hebrew name, Paul is a Greek name. And I think we as English speakers sometimes just miss, because they sound very similar, we assume that he's changed. And I've even heard people say, he changed his name because he became a Christian. Actually, it's more likely that when he became a Christian, he started hanging around in a lot of Greek-speaking areas.
Yes.
So, and people won't realize often that Saul, in its Hebrew pronunciation, is very hard to say if you're from a Greek-speaking background.
Yes.
So likewise, now John Mark, exactly as you're saying, we're seeing a kind of New Testament pattern of almost leaning into names that reflect the places the gospel takes them, which I think is actually a really interesting and exciting
I think it's beautiful.
little thought, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is.
But we're going to jump into a text, and there's a particular text you have in mind you want us to jump to today?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a great place to start, though it's probably the most controversial place to start, is Acts 15. And from verse 36 onwards, we get this very, very controversial, very painful moment where Barnabas and Paul separate. They are separating over their opinion on John Mark. So I think it's worth starting there, and then that sets the scene of why they sort of separate over John Mark and the backstory behind that. And then that sort of sets up where we see this restorative journey. So I think that's worthwhile starting there, David.
Excellent. Well, I'll read this then, John. So a little bit of context. Paul and Barnabas are this power missionary couple, would that be fair to say, working their way around doing phenomenal gospel work. They've come to a council meeting, really, of the early church, haven't they, to sort of work through a variety of challenges they're facing. And this is sort of just finished up. They're in Antioch, and they're doing some teaching. And then we pick up the story in Acts 15, verse 36, don't we? So it reads like this. It says, "After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, 'Come, let us return and visit the brothers and sisters in every city where we proclaimed the word of the Lord, and see how they are doing.' Barnabas wanted to take with them John, also called Mark. But Paul decided not to take with them one who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not accompanied them in the work. The disagreement became so sharp that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and set out, the brothers and sisters commending him to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So is that a good place to stop? You happy?
So it's a perfect place to stop. Yeah, absolutely. Because when we move into chapter 16, two things happen when you move into chapter 16. Number one, the story really focuses on Paul. And so Luke really then tells us the story through Paul's eyes. And he is very much the key protagonist in the rest of the book of Acts. And the other then thing that happens is Barnabas and John Mark disappear from the Acts narrative. It's quite striking, quite shocking in some ways. They literally disappear. They are not mentioned again in the book of Acts. We have to go beyond the book of Acts to get pick up our breadcrumbs again on this. So it is a bit of a moment. And two great friends who have forged their friendship in ministry, and especially a first missionary trip where, some phenomenal things happen and also some quite brutal things. Both men are quite brutally persecuted. Paul is stoned at one point, probably the singular stoning that he references in Corinth to the Corinthians. So these guys have scars together. They have worked together. They have literally stood together for Jesus. Barnabas has defended Paul to the hilt before the apostles and even brought him out of obscurity to serve in Antioch. So these two men have serious miles on the board. And yet something so fundamental in their opinion of this young man, John Mark, happens that they cannot see eye to eye. They literally do divide and split on this. So it's worthwhile then, what on earth could have happened to cause two men to not agree so strongly that they cannot even continue to journey together? Now, there's no hint in the text that they fell out with each other from the point of view of hatred or nastiness or bitterness. It's just they literally do split on this opinion, and the word used there is extremely strong in terms of that split and division, paroxysmos, and it's a really strong sense of, my goodness, they could not find an agreed position on this, and so therefore they split.
And it's interesting, in some ways, the New Testament's references to Paul are that he is definitely a fiery character. Barnabas, of course, is the son of encouragement, quite literally. So if he lives up to his name, which he seems to, from our understanding of him, so this is quite clearly a significant thing if these two characters, particularly with their focus on the gospel being so intense. So do you want to dig into us? This is a kind of key part from the terms of your research for this book. Let's talk about that disagreement then. What can we know about it, John?
Well, I think what's really interesting to note, first of all, is how Paul describes John Mark's actions. Paul describes John Mark's actions as having deserted them. Now, for our listeners who know the story, who have tracked the story, then there is a little flag back to chapter 13. So we're introduced to John Mark in chapter 12. He's the son of Mary. Mary's house is open to the believers there, well known to Peter. It's obviously a clearly dynamic household of faith. And when Peter gets out of prison, it's the first house he goes to. So this is a serious home of followers of Jesus. Mark has been raised in that home. John Mark has. And then Barnabas and Saul take them on the first missionary trip. It's all going so well till they get to Perga. And when they get to Perga, there's a shift. And it looks like Paul is leading the team now. It looks like there's more of an emphasis towards Gentiles. This could be part of the reason John Mark becomes unsettled, being a relative of Barnabas, a cousin. But for one reason or another, it says in chapter 13 that John Mark left them. Now, Dr. Luke, remember, when Luke is writing this, he knows John Mark. I mean, these are now friends. These guys are contemporaries. And there's no doubt that Luke, working with Paul, knew Mark, who by that time was the scribe of Peter. And so I think Luke's been really kind in chapter 13. He's showing that John Mark left, but he's not using strong language. He said he left them. Whereas when 2 years later it comes back to the opportunity of bringing John Mark on the next trip, Paul says, no, he didn't leave us. He deserted us. He abandoned us. And he uses a much stronger word. And I think that's the heart of the challenge. Paul, though clearly he's accepted John Mark to an extent because they're now back in Antioch and they've taken him back, but Paul doesn't trust John Mark. He's deserted once before, he will desert again. And Barnabas, of course, son of encouragement, probably a template for an Ephesians 4:11 pastor in the New Testament, even though he's called an apostle. Barnabas, of course, defends John Mark in the same way that Barnabas defended Paul earlier when Paul was excluded potentially from the apostles. Barnabas was the one who went to the apostles on behalf of Paul and defended him. And so Barnabas is doing what he's done before. He's generous, good-hearted. He believes the best in people. He believed the best in Saul, and bringing him to the apostles. He gets Saul out of obscurity to bring him to Antioch. Barnabas has a track record of rescuing people, and he's now standing up to rescue his cousin John Mark. But Paul is having none of it, and he's saying, no, he deserted us, and he's not going with us. And you get two men who both love Jesus, both love the church, and both love the world, now divided over their perhaps personality, gift shape, and worldview, which now zeroes in on John Mark. Paul, the go-getter, the apostle, the pioneer, he can't risk another journey with someone who might go AWOL. Barnabas, the pastor, the generous man, the son of encouragement, says, listen, we can't keep writing everybody off who makes a mistake. Let's give the boy a second chance. And ironically, I think, David, both men are right. I mean, this is the problem here. I think both men are right. And it's interesting, in Acts 15, it says that they're sent off having been commended by the brothers. So there's a sense in which, though there's a split here, it doesn't look like it is deeply acrimonious to the point that there's hatred involved. But it's two men seeing one man through the lens of their own worldview, and they cannot bring reconciliation to this, and therefore the only option is to separate and to divide. And so Paul takes Silas and Barnabas takes John Mark. So I think that's the heart of the story. John Mark does something which so upset Paul that even though Paul seems to have forgiven him, Paul refuses to reconcile with him to the extent that Paul brings him back on the team. Whereas Barnabas goes, well, not only have I forgiven him, but I'm going to give him a second chance. And I think that's the heart of the story there.
And of course, this is about them traveling around the Greco-Roman world together. So, I mean, we have a tendency when we think about these things of modernizing them in our minds, don't we? But actually, this is quite a dangerous situation to be in, to set out on a trip with a required number of people, and for one of the people to decide halfway through the trip, I don't think I'm going to do this anymore. This is more than just, there's an extra seat on the bus now, isn't it? This could be life-threatening if all of a sudden you're a team member short. Would you think that's fair to say?
Yes, it is. And if that's true, you see, then it shows, hold on, there's real strength of feeling over this split. These men this isn't just a casual spat here. This isn't just two men who are not getting over themselves. They are both holding such deeply held convictions over how they see John Mark that they are refusing to find middle ground. Paul sees him as a risk. Paul, if you have that grace-truth dynamic, grace and truth, I think Paul leads with truth, and he goes, look, the boy deserted us and we can't take the risk. Barnabas leads with grace and he says, the boy deserted us. We can't cut him loose. We've got to actually pull him back in. So both men are not hiding from the fact that John Mark deserted them. But both men have a very different view of what to do next. And in Barnabas, you've got an extension of come with us again. That's the best way. Get back on the horse sort of thing. Whereas Paul's saying, nah, we can't risk it. And the strength of their conviction is so strong that it ends up, in some ways, some might argue, one of the saddest splits in the New Testament, although it does end up producing 2 missionary trips instead of 1.
Yes.
But yeah, it's a sad moment in some ways.
Yeah. Yes. No. As you say, we end up with Silas, and we start to see different stories develop there. And obviously, Luke follows the narrative with Paul. I mean, it seems like at this stage in the Acts, Luke is now a first-hand eyewitness to all of these stories, isn't he? So it makes sense that he goes with Paul, so he's a little unsure as to what to say about Barnabas and Mark because he's not with them anymore. But turn that around, so we know a lot about Paul, that at the end of your 5th chapter of the book, you talk a bit about Barnabas and second chances. And there's this little line that I'd love you to dig into this question here. Barnabas, on behalf of every follower of Jesus, I thank you. And so there's this sense that Barnabas is doing something for John that's modeling something for all of us, and it's helping us in a whole host of ways. And so almost, we're not doing a book review today, John, but I want to lean into Barnabas' actions a little bit more, which is slightly harder to do because there's less said about him. But what is it that so leads you to thankfulness for Barnabas in this, after a long reflection on John Mark?
Yeah, I mean, Barney, as I affectionately call him, Barney is just one of my heroes in the New Testament. When I was writing this chapter, I was in the Gospel of Mark. David is part of my everyday devotions. And there was a morning where I was reading Mark and I started to cry. And I wasn't crying because Mark said something profound. I was crying because I realized Mark would not have penned these words had Barnabas not taken him. And there's a beautiful expression in Acts 15. It's really easy to miss in the midst of this sort of collateral and the furore and the energy and the shouting. It just says this: Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. And you know, even now I struggle with my emotion on it. That Barnabas could not have imagined that when he took that boy with him, what that boy would become. And the young man, with the words of Paul telling him he's unfit for the next journey ringing in his ears, disappears out of the narrative of the book of Acts with Barnabas, but doesn't disappear from the story. And even though he's out of the view of Dr. Luke, the story continues to be written. And Barnabas's love and care for John Mark, and eventually the influence of Peter, which we may want to reflect on, ensures that not only does John Mark survive, but John Mark eventually becomes the writer of the first gospel. The bishop or shepherd of the Christian community in Alexandria, one of the most influential cities in the Roman Empire at that time, and eventually dies a horrific martyr's death for the cause of Christ. And there's this incredible redemptive moment. If Barnabas hadn't have taken John Mark may have been lost to the story. His words may never have been written. He may never have pastored Alexandria and may never have died a martyr's death and become, as far as the Orthodox Christian community is concerned, the winged lion. That's their symbol of John Mark. And so I say, as I read the Gospel of Mark that day, I remember it became the inspiration for this line. I remember speaking out loud, Lord Jesus, thank you for Barnabas. Thank you for Barnabas. Thank you that Barnabas didn't give up on this boy whose book I am now reading and whose words have enriched billions of people with the first gospel. So I think that's why we should thank God for Barney.
No, it's well, and of course, his even just to push this character a little further, like you've alluded to already, his role around Paul becomes really significant as well, doesn't it? Like, just if you're earlier in the story of Acts, Saul has been this persecutor of the church, hasn't he? He's caused all these problems. And Acts 9 verse 26, when this is Saul, Paul, had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were all afraid of him, for they did not believe he was a disciple. It's a good plan, to be fair. You're going around killing Christians. Yes. Pretend you're a Christian to find out where they meet and get inside. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and described for them how on the road he had seen the Lord who had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had spoken boldly in the name of Jesus. I mean, here's a character that just likes sticking his neck out to give people a chance, isn't he? He is. Like, we know so little about him, but what we do know is this.
It's true. And of course, he wasn't called Barnabas when we first meet him. He was called Joseph. He's Joseph, the Levite from Cyprus. But he's called Barnabas because he's so dynamic in his commitment to encouragement that the apostles rename him Son of Encouragement. And there's a track record. One of the great disservices we can do to Barnabas when it comes to John Mark is that we can think Barney only stands up for John Mark because he's his cousin. Yeah. And that's a mistake. And it's a mistake because we ignore the trajectory of the Acts text. And it's really, really important. We've already encountered Barnabas on at least 3 occasions pre this moment. So you see him selling a field in Acts chapter 4. I mean, who sells real estate to give the money to the poor? So Barnabas liquidates real estate and gives it to the apostles. Then we see him representing Saul to the apostles. Then we see the apostles sending him to Antioch when this move of God breaks out in the third largest city of the Roman Empire. And they don't go themselves. They send Barney. And the reason is because he's from that area. He's from Cyprus. So he's probably used to Gentile, Greek, Jewish mixing. And then when he's at Antioch, now listen to this one. This is incredible. When he's at Antioch, he then goes and finds Saul. And Saul is at Tarsus. Now, you read this in the text. He went and found Saul, who was at Tarsus. And you just read that. But that's a 400-kilometer round trip. Right? So he has to make his way to Tarsus, and then he has to find this man. And then he brings him back, and for a whole year, they teach the believers at Antioch. And then Barnabas and Saul take gifts for the poor and the needy back down to Jerusalem. So this man has a track record of sticking his neck out for the broken, sticking his neck out for the controversial, to lean back to our Jesus stuff, sticking his neck out for the margins. He's pushing himself out here. So when we see him defending John Mark, we must not do a disservice to Barnabas by saying, well, he's just standing up for his cousin, right? No, he's not. He's standing up for a principle that he believes in, and the principle is second chance. The principle is, let's give this boy another go. Yes. And if we do that, then maybe he can become something. Paul isn't invested in that way, in the way that John Mark is, or the way that Barnabas is. And Paul says, no, we can't risk it. And so both men divide on the way they see this moment. So it's very powerful, Barnabas' influence, and we should thank God for Barney, I think, for both Saul's sake, Paul's sake, and John Mark's sake.
The Testament would be quite short without him, wouldn't
it? Exactly. You took the words right out of my mouth, David. If you took Paul's writings out of the New Testament and Mark's writings out of the New Testament, and if Paul wasn't there, Luke wouldn't be there, we wouldn't have a New Testament. It wouldn't be there. And Barney is the influence behind all of that. He is the man who brings Saul to light and releases his gift, and he's the man who defends John Mark and allows the pen of John Mark to eventually scribble his glorious gospel on a parchment.
And of course, it's worth mentioning as well that with Mark likely being the earliest of the Gospels, one of the things we see is that Mark also sets the frame up for how a gospel is shaped. So if you look at Matthew and Luke, they follow Mark's model as to how to do this, don't they? In fact, there's huge chunks of Mark's story. When Luke comes to compile his gospel, it does look like he's just taken Mark verbatim at many places and said, I'll do this. So even Matthew and Luke Luke disappears, Mark disappears. Matthew would look very different without Mark as well.
I noticed a little beautiful connector with his gospel. Now, this could be a huge stretch, so our listeners are used to us going out on limbs here, but I think there's some credence to this, and haven't seen this anywhere, David. This is John Andrews now, sort of going out there on a limb. But with my Hebrew studies, I was aware that the opening verse of the Bible in Genesis begins with a 7-word Hebrew statement. Now, in English, it's 10 words, but in Hebrew, it's 7. And when I was coming to study Mark in the original language, I noticed, hey, Mark's also got a 7-word Greek opening statement. Now, in English, it reads, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. And I just had a little moment where I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then a thought struck me, which could be completely out there, but I'm going to land it anyway, that there are some incredible similarities between Mark and Moses. Moses is the first person to pen, we believe, the first words of the Bible, introducing God to us. Mark is potentially the first person to pen the gospel of Jesus Christ, introducing Jesus to us, of which others were. Mark and Moses both deserted. Moses ran away, lived in the wilderness for 40 years, and then recovered and came back. And Mark, of course, deserted his post with Paul and Barnabas. And both men had some form of disability. Moses is referred to as having a fat or heavy tongue. And some of our extra biblical sort of documents point to Mark having stump fingers. So you get this beautiful symmetry between Moses, who introduces God to the world, and Mark, who introduces Jesus to the world. One introduces God in the first creation. Mark introduces Jesus in the new creation. Both of them begin their stories with 7 words in their own language. Both of them had deserted. Both of them had a disability. And both of them bring something really dynamic to the text. Now, I could be reaching seriously in all of that, David. So I'm open to have my backside kicked there. But it's at least a nice conversation over coffee to think about, wow, there's a beautiful little symmetry there in the background of both men.
Well, and these things are just beautiful sometimes to see, aren't they? Just to go, okay, it's fascinating how these things in history almost align, that you see these characters appear and do similar things and have different journeys. So I those are sort of beautiful moments, I think, just to sort of almost breathe in for a little moment or two, aren't they? And just enjoy. So no, I love all of this that we're sort of scratching around with, John. I love the kind of engagement to think about Barnabas, the conversations and thoughts about Mark. Even like I find myself reflecting, perhaps I'm pushing it too far, but there's a church tradition that holds that in Mark's gospel, there's a scene at the end of Mark's gospel where this young man sort of runs, during the arrest scene of Jesus, this young man runs away naked because of the sort of panic of this arrest situation. And there's this tradition, and this is not in the Bible, but it's a strongly held Christian tradition, that this is Mark referring to himself, isn't it? Of course, what's really interesting is it's this just anonymous young man, right? And it's scholars would refer to as potentially what they call an anonymous autograph, as this is me in the story. What's fascinating is you meet this young man running away, unclothed, not wanting to be caught near Jesus. But then in Mark's language, he uses the word young man twice in the whole gospel. And the second time he uses this word young man, in Mark chapter 16, there's a young man, and again there's a reference to what he's wearing. But this time it's not that he's wearing nothing. Now this time he's clothed in white, right? And he is the first person in Mark's gospel to announce that Christ is risen. And so, again, pushing out just into the ether of, if this young man is the same person, and it is interesting that young man's only used twice, both references to young man reference his clothing. There's a beautiful movement from abandoning Jesus to now announcing the resurrection.
Absolutely.
Huge if, If it's John Mark, that's really interesting. Really interesting, particularly with the story in Acts and everything like that. But even if it's not John Mark, it's interesting because you're seeing this second chance restoration motif, which seems to be part of Mark's life journey. Is that fair to say?
Totally on the money. Yeah, I do sort of lean into that, and in leaning into that, I try to say, look, this is speculative, but it's worth a little nudge. It's worth a little look, and your summary is absolutely as I've tried to summarize it. If it is John Mark, that is a gorgeous little anonymous inclusion, which is brilliant. If it's not, he's the only gospel writer who includes it. And with the resurrection link, there's definitely a sensitivity to a deserter made good sort of thing. And if you parallel that with one other thought, David, and that is Peter himself. So remember, if Peter is the influence behind John Mark in writing his gospel, John Mark is the scribe of Peter, then you've got John Mark is the first person to introduce to us Peter's own desertion and the fact that Mark talks about Peter blaspheming, not just denying Jesus, but blaspheming and using very, very strong language. And although Peter keeps the action of the disciple cutting off Malchus's ear anonymous, John blows the lid on that. John lets the world know it was Peter and Malchus. Thanks for that, John. But Mark keeps the identity of Peter's story. Every other element of the denial and desertion story of Peter is brutally and clearly presented. But there is one beautiful little parallel, and it's this. At the resurrection, so we get this gorgeous allusion. When the women meet this young man, what does the young man say? He says, tell his disciples and Peter. So that's the only time the and Peter is included, and it's in the Mark text. And you get this gorgeous symmetry of redemption. If John Mark is the young man running in the garden, you get a beautiful symmetry to the young man at the resurrection. Peter's own desertion and denial has a similar symmetry in that you get the statement, and Peter, and it is striking that both men are probably sitting in the room together discussing what goes into that gospel, and both men know the pain of desertion and the glory of redemption. So I think if you're prepared, I wouldn't build my house on that, but if you are prepared to countenance that Mark sitting there talking to his father, Peter. Peter describes Mark as his son, and he's scratching the words onto the parchment. I am certain both of them have tears in their eyes and smiles on their faces as those little cameos are inserted into the text.
Yes. They're absolutely fantastic, John, aren't
Isn't
they?
it gorgeous?
I mean, something's going on in all of this, even if the way that we're stitching it together isn't the right way to stick it together. There's something happening in all of these things, aren't they?
It's true.
And you see, and even just thinking about, you've got John Mark deserting Paul and Barnabas, offered second chances, possibly running away during the crucifixion, getting a second chance. Peter denying Jesus, getting a second chance. And it just strikes me, all the things we've said about Barnabas, his desire to fight and defend them in the margins. Even Barnabas has a second chance story. When Paul's writing in Galatians, and there's this moment of where the Christian Jews sort of miss the gospel a little bit, Paul, in some sense of surprise, says even Barnabas missed it at this point. But obviously Barnabas comes back from that as well. So you've got all these key characters, all of them requiring at least one second chance, maybe more. Well, John,
and of course, I was just going to say, which might lead us to our next episode, of course, we might want to argue that in the final recorded words of Paul about Mark, that Paul also takes his second chance. And there is an interesting link there that Paul uses language that makes a very strong allusion to Acts 15. And that's one of the ideas we're going to pick up in the next podcast. So maybe even Paul too gets the second chance as far as John Mark's concerned.
Well, that's it for this bonus episode, but we'll be back in 2 days' time with the second part
to talk some more about John's new book, Second Chance.